Our guest today is Tom Ravetz, and Tom is a priest of the Christian community, an author. He's the editor of Perspectives magazine and a poet as well, and has a very good Substack, which I'll link below the description. And Tom's written many wonderful books, one particularly that I've read several times called From Dogma. But Tom, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Very nice to be here.
Pleasure to have you. Um, there are many different areas we could explore, but I would really like to start, if that's okay, maybe just hearing a little bit about your background, how you came into the sphere of the work of Rudolf Steiner and also the Christian community. And so if you'd be happy to introduce yourself to our listeners and viewers, that would be wonderful.
Gladly. Yeah. So I was born in Leeds in England in 1964 and grew up in a free-thinking household. So no religious affiliation, actually. And but nevertheless, yeah, very, I would say in the sort of most neutral sense of the word, spiritual, in the sense of seeking and believing in values and but not in any kind of denominational way. I went on a few spiritual journeys that my parents were part of. My dad had a period of involvement with the Divine Light Mission, so I used to go and listen to satsang every now and again. And then my mum also had a Quaker period, and I think it says something about the 10 or 11-year-old child that I was, that I did actually like going and sitting in Quaker meeting. And that's an affinity that's never quite left me, actually. I think the Quakers have got something very special and important. But mainly, I was just a fairly ordinary child with a fairly ordinary upbringing, I guess. University people, and yeah, child of my age, which now actually feels like a kind of it's like a sort of historical fossil looking back to a childhood in the 1970s and early 80s. Just yeah, we're standing somehow in a very different epoch. And I left school knowing that I didn't just want to go to university because it was the next thing on the conveyor belt. Maybe both of my parents being senior lecturers and professors and so on helped me to come to that insight, but really not knowing what I did want to do. And so I went and did really nothing very energetically for about half a year. My then girlfriend lived in Edinburgh. She was studying there already. So she went off early in the morning and did stuff in greenhouses. She was studying botany. And I lay around and went to the student bar at noon and played pool and learned how to cook vegetarian curry. That was my one real achievement in that time. But that wasn't enough. And so, a bit like the prodigal son, I landed in a hole from which I couldn't see a way out. And well, what I say usually when I tell this story, I was so desperate. I listened to some advice that my mother gave me, which was something I hadn't done for at least 5 years previously. And she suggested that I go and have a look at Botton Village, which was a Camphill village inspired by Rudolf Steiner's work in the North York Moors, actually not far away from where I grew up. And I went there and arrived on a very cold, windy February after Sunday afternoon. And I didn't have the words at that time, but as I put my foot on the ground, getting out of the car, which actually I had to sort of hold onto the door to stop it being wrenched from my grasp by the North York gale, North York small gale, I had a feeling which I would now describe as I'm going to find my destiny here. And so I became a co-worker. I had a place at university actually, which I'd deferred for a year, and I soon decided that wasn't going to be nearly as interesting as staying in Boston. And yeah, that in a way I've never left. I mean, obviously physically I've left, but that moment at 18, I did indeed meet my destiny. So I met Camphill, the Camphill Movement. So an approach to anthroposophy bedded completely in the practical life and in the sort of social life, community life. And I sometimes feel as if I squeezed in those years. Like I was 18 when I arrived there, so in fact, I think maybe I was still 17 when I arrived there. Uh, no, I would have been 18. That's right, 1980, 82, the year I turned 18. Um, so yeah, 18 to 22, I was there more or less. And it feels like I kind of squeezed in some of the elements of a Waldorf education, um, which I definitely had not had. But I sort of just perforce, I ended up doing zoorhythmy, and I built compost heaps, and I learned how to do practical things. And yeah, so this university child got a bit of an initiation in the practical side of life, driving tractors and things. But of course, also more importantly, probably, I went to the library actually. They put me in the garden, and I thought to myself, okay, well, there seems to be an interesting philosophy behind this. And being the child of my parents, I went to the library to find out all about it, took a book off the shelf, Culture and Horticulture, and read the preface. And in the preface, it says, we're all frightfully clever, and we've learned that the sun goes around the earth. And that's really important. And of course, it's true, very, very central, important insight. However, for the plant, the sun, the earth is flat, and the sun rises over there. It makes a big bow through the sky, and it sets over there. And it's completely uninteresting what we've worked out through our telescopes and spaceships, because for the plant, yeah, the plant lives in a geocentric world. And I remember reading that and thinking, oh, I completely understand that, but I would never have thought that myself. How do I learn how to think that for myself? And that was the beginning of what has carried on, a passionate interest in, well, anthroposophy. And I mean, that would, in a way, that's not even a sort of anthroposophical insight. That would be a Goethean insight. So finding the way of looking at a plant which is relevant for the plant. And that's accompanied me ever since. Yeah, so that's how I landed in the Steiner movement.
Okay. Oh, a beautiful story, actually.
Hmm.
And then from there to the Christian community, how did you come into contact with this movement?
Yeah, so Button was the pioneering and the last, I think, Camphill place that had this picture of a priest being part of the community and the church being embedded in the community. And the great sort of proponent of that was Peter Roth, who was the priest there when I was there. He was one of the founders of Camphill, one of Carl Koenig's youth group back in the day, who'd then got ordained after the war, I think. Yeah, just after the war. And he had this vision of in a way, like a, a new kind of medieval village. So the church would be as central as the church would have been back in medieval times. And so it was there. And I think I remember going along soon after I arrived, because I just basically went to everything because there wasn't really anything else to do. This is, after all, this is the days before internet and everything. You didn't have a whole world of entertainment in your pocket. Um, and I thought it was completely bizarre, not having really been exposed to much ritual worship at all through my life. Sometimes I'd sort of almost at random ended up in a school assembly or a chapel or whatever. But church was a closed book to me. And I think actually I remember I had this image of what would these nice Steiner people do on a Sunday morning in their church, partly influenced by the old title of the Christian Community Journal, actually, The Threshing Floor, which gives you this kind of rustic feeling. And I kind of imagine guitars being involved, and probably candles, and maybe even incense, and something very heartfelt and sort of communitarian. So to come into the world of the act of consecration, which was I'm sure many of your viewers know, but many of them maybe don't. So it's a new kind of service, a modern form of the Mass, but it is the Mass, and it's identifiably deeply liturgical Christian service. In England, we'd say bells and smells. So there is actually a bell at the beginning. and there's incense and the sort of, well, again, in England, we would say high church. And this whole spectacle, as it were, what I experienced then as a spectacle unfolding before me, I just thought, well, it's completely strange, got nothing to do with it. So I didn't go back until I'd been in Botton for about 3 years. Meanwhile, I'd taken on the garden and more or less learned how to grow vegetables by trial and error. Um, and yeah, I was turning 21, and right on time, I had a really, really good biographical crisis. And in my 21st year, and I went back to the church. Really, I guess, feeling, well, maybe that will help. And yeah, I had this thing that we worked really hard in Botton. I was working in the garden, sometimes getting up early and milking, helping out on the farm. And then because it was kind of self-administered, there was always an evening meeting about something or other. And then we had this wonderful kind of youth group scene going on where we were doing kind of sort of peer counseling with each other and talking about anthroposophy and the deepest things in our lives. I didn't realize it, but I was in the process of falling in love with Deborah, who's now my wife. And so that was many hours of talking and yeah, deepening our understanding of things. And then I went to bed, and I kind of read the whole of world literature. I worked my way through things like War and Peace and Crime and Punishment, and I was also reading Steiner. So, I mean, looking back, I have no idea how I survived actually. But it was one of those kind of peak times in my life. But it did have the side effect that if I sat down and I wasn't talking, I fell asleep. That was just automatic. And in the service, I wasn't going to be talking at all. That was really clear. And so I really almost always fell asleep fairly near the beginning. And I didn't like it. It wasn't nice. It's not nice to, have to struggle like that. But somehow, and maybe even as a function of this half waking, half sleeping state that I was in, after a little while, I had a very powerful experience. A kind of, yeah, I don't quite know how to describe it. An imagination that kind of grew within me, but it didn't feel like I was making it up. And that had to do with the water of life and the feeling that behind the altar, the water of life was flowing down. I probably wouldn't have used that name for it. I would have just said there's a waterfall cascading down, and it's flowing out into the chapel. And really, I almost sort of had the feeling if my toes, nerve endings were just slightly differently organized, I'd feel this wet. I might have almost felt surprised when I came out of the church that my shoes weren't dripping, and that it was flowing out beyond the chapel out into the world. And the world needed this water. The world was parched and cracked, like when you see pictures of the riverbed in a drought. And it gets cracked like crazy paving. So, which was a strange image to have for a young man trying to be a good gardener in the North York Moors, because drought is not one of the problems you face up there. So obviously this water wasn't, I knew I didn't need to top up the the watering cistern. This was a different kind of water. Yeah, and this experience, it must have come back at least a couple of times, because first of all, I had the feeling, gosh, I'm supposed to go and do something with that water. And I kind of, like I said, I really was the sort of tabula rasa. I didn't really know what happened in churches. But I kind of looked around and I noticed, okay, well, the one thing that people seem to do is stand up and go to the front and receive communion. So I'd probably better go and do that. Not, having been baptized or instructed in the Christian faith or anything like that. Sometimes nowadays I have the same situation where somebody comes to our service and comes up afterwards and said, I don't really know whether I believe in God, but I came and took communion. And I feel that my destiny has uniquely placed me, uniquely qualified me to be a good pastor in that situation, because I can be very reassuring and say, well, actually, maybe sometimes our legs know better than our heads what we're supposed to go and do. So that was the first step. And then strangely, I started to have the feeling, yeah, that's not quite enough. And yeah, and then this feeling grew. I need to help this water. I need it to, I've got something to do with bringing this water out into the world. And I mean, again, really a little bit like the Goethean way of looking at plants, I kind of looked around and thought, well, who gets to do that then? And it seemed to be the priest. Because after all, 8 times through the service, the priest turns round. I mean, most of the time the priest is facing the same way as we are, but then he turns round and he says the beautiful words, the Christ in you. And of course, he's also the one that shares out the communion. So somehow it was clear to my rather sort of befuddled, sleepy brain, the priest is somehow centrally involved in this water transport. And that was, amazingly enough, that was the germ of what then became my my decision to go and study in Stuttgart and become a priest, if they would have me.
Okay, and they did.
They did, yes. Yes, much to my surprise, looking back. Yeah, I went through relatively quickly. Um, I mean, there would be many stories to tell, most of which probably I'd have to ask you to take out of the edit.
Okay.
It was a very different world. I went to the seminary in 1987, and it was still it was a world, a German anthroposophical world, which had really been formed by the pupils of Steiner, and a great resurgence that happened in Germany after the Second World War, when the Waldorf school movement really took off, and many of the churches were built, and yeah, it felt like it was going to be there forever and ever. Um, and coming in as a rather sort of wet behind the ears English person with minimal German was a kind of initiation process in itself. But I survived and went through, and I was ordained in 1991. So, in fact, yeah, before my 27th birthday, I was ordained at 26, which is why I said, looking back, in a way, to my surprise, because my teachers must have had a clear eye for potential, because what was there already sort of fully manifest was probably, yeah, not so impressive. But so I'm one of those ones that had the grace to basically spend, more or less the whole of my adult life in the priesthood. We have a fairly open policy. I think many churches do. We have some people who come through now. Actually, in the last years, we had some people even younger than that, so 22, 23. But we will take people now. Actually, we ordained somebody in Britain who's already in his 60s. So we're quite kind of open, and of course, it's amazing when somebody brings in experience from a long professional life, perhaps as a teacher or a farmer or something. So that's amazing for us, and enriches the priest circle. And there is also something quite special about somebody who spends basically their whole life as a priest, and which of course means you do a lot of growing up in this amazing profession. And yeah, and now, I turned 61 in the summer, and I can look back on, oh, good dear, I'm losing all my dates, but yeah, I can look back on, well, if I was ordained in 1991, then that's 34 years of priesthood, I think, it works out as. And that's quite nice, to have been doing something for long enough that you've been in different congregations and had different phases and so on. So yeah, it's been a very rewarding time for me.
Okay. Yeah. Wonderful. And Tom, so this movement, the Christian community, sometimes referred to as the movement for religious renewal. Um, I just want to tie that or ask you some questions about the movement in regards to this idea that we can have, or there is a possibility for a Christianity free from dogma. And
Yeah,
what that means, because, if we talk to someone who's well, from another side of Christianity, let's say, a more traditional side, there'll often be statements such as that the dogma is central, and
Yeah,
you can't really have, if you haven't got the dogma, what have you got in some
yeah,
ways?
yeah,
So, yeah, would you be, if you're happy to explore that a little bit?
yeah, yeah. I mean, maybe I can sort of start a bit further back
Please do.
in a
Yeah,
way.
yeah.
Um, so the there's well, I one of the things I did in this long career as a priest was through a funny kind of quirk of destiny. I studied theology part-time alongside my priestly work when I was in Aberdeen, and so I'm going to draw on a little bit of knowledge from that time. Um, and yeah, there was certainly at that time, I think in the 60s and 70s, there was this big debate going on because it's a feature, particularly of Western Christianity, that orthodoxy, so right belief would be the sort of translation of orthodox, um, became very, very central. And, to the extent, obviously, of, heresy being outlawed and then the Inquisition and all the dreadful things. And in a way, our sort of modern world and the Enlightenment and freedom of belief and so on, really is largely a reaction to that emphasis on the right things to believe, the things that you have to believe. Um, and there's a contrasting concept. So there's orthodoxy, right belief, and then there's orthopraxy, and praxis means behavior. It's where our word practical comes from. Also, where our word pragmatic comes from, interestingly. And pragmatic philosophically means something a bit different from sort of, just being a bit kind of crass and not caring about principles. So orthodoxy and orthopraxy. And obviously, if you go back to the earliest church, and or even before there's something called a church, um, you could say, well, what was the orthodoxy of the disciples? Um, and I mean, they didn't sign up to the Athanasian Creed. Um, I think if you'd said to them, "What's the Trinity?" they would have been quite surprised. Um, and if they grasped, I mean, you can think of Peter's confession in Matthew 8, where Jesus says, who do people say that I am? And he says, you are the Christ. Maybe he said, you are the Son of God. That's actually an interesting question. Um, but what he meant by that certainly wasn't what you would read if you open a standard theology primer about the relationship of the persons of the Trinity and how the incarnation works. Because all of that, working it all out, was the work of about 4.5 centuries. So, so you could say, okay, well, if it wasn't, Jesus didn't come along with a library of books and say, right, understand all this, sign up, and I'll call you Christians. After all, remember, Jesus didn't use the word Christian because it wasn't invented. Um, so what did he come along with? Well, he came along with an incredible experience. People had the experience through him that they came into relationship with God, with ultimate reality. Perhaps also you could say they came into relationship with their truest, deepest self. They came into relationship with something healing and wholesome, with something liberating. They discovered new possibilities of being human, or rediscovered possibilities of being human, and they started to behave in those ways. So it's so wonderful. We've got the book of Acts, which nobody ever reads. But after the four Gospels, there's in a way the fifth Gospel, in a certain sense. There are many things called the fifth Gospel. And in a way, the first fifth Gospel is the book of Acts. And it's called the Acts of the Apostles. It's what they did. It's not a primer in systematic theology. It does, you know, Nowhere in the Gospels does Jesus roll his sleeves up and say, okay, guys, I'm going to sit down now and I'm going to tell you how it works. God is one in three and three in one, three divine persons in one divine substance, and I'm the Son of God, and I was born of a virgin, and so on. You know, that if you think of the teaching in the Gospels, it never has that character. It's never a theology seminar. It's always related to life, it's related to experience, and it's always, well, I'm making very sweeping statements now, but mainly, like if you think of the parables, they're about how we conduct ourselves. And of course, if you come to it with a background of knowing about something like the Trinity and understanding or groping to understand what it might mean that in Jesus, the Son of God became a human being, you have an amazing dimension and a deeper understanding of what you read there, to the extent that it's one of the things that often happens to students when they study theology is they have to get over noticing when the professor says Jesus didn't teach about the Trinity. To begin with, they really resist that because Jesus taught about everything. Of course he did. He was the Son of God, so of course he taught about it. So in the book of Acts, there's also very little theological instruction, certainly systematic theological instruction, the sort of philosophical side. It's about how we live, it's about what we do, it's about sort of teasing out what it means to be a Jew and a Christian, and all of these great questions that St. Paul goes on and wrestles with in his letters. So all of this is to say, the beginning of Christianity is not dogma, and therefore it's not orthodoxy, because there isn't a doxy, there isn't a dogma to hold on to. The beginning of Christianity is an experience which issues in new decisions about how to live. And then you can actually trace this, how in the early centuries of the church, I mean, to begin with, it was fairly wild in a way, you could say, from the point of view of sort of what might be called church discipline. So you had people who were in some way touched by their experience of Jesus Christ, either who'd known him when he was alive or who'd experienced him powerfully in a similar way to Paul, obviously, because Paul didn't meet him when he was alive. So the beginning for Paul was an experience, not of an incarnate human being, but of the experience at Damascus. Well, there were lots of other people having those sorts of experiences, but they're not in the New Testament. And in fact, you can read some of the things that they wrote. It's called the Apocryphal Gospels. And there are apocryphal letters and things. And so then over the first centuries, there was this process of forming what came to be called the canon. So there's the canonical books of the New Testament. Canon is the Greek word for yardstick. So it's actually quite interesting that the early bishops, because gradually the bishops became the sort of authorities, they started to want to apply a yardstick to be able to distinguish who's inside the church and who's outside. Now, that already sounds pretty horrid, like, oh my goodness, I mean, why do we have to keep people outside? I suppose if I spoke in their defense, I would say they were aware that one of the things that Jesus Christ seemed to want to do was to create a community. And one of the things about communities is that you know where they begin and end. So if you say this is a community, in a way, what you're saying is I've made a boundary. And there are people inside the community, and then there are also people outside. Hopefully, you've got a porous boundary, so there's a way for people to come in, but that actually will be described. If you say I've got a community, then you'll need to know, okay, well, what are the membership conditions? What are we signed up for? And that can be a horrid thing to do, and then it's, in a way, that's a clique. If you just say, well, the membership conditions are that you like me, and we all think the same, then that's a clique. But thankfully, there are forms of community that aren't cliques. They're a positive force in the world. And the reason why it's kind of justifiable to make an inside and outside is a recognition that there's an increase in our capacity, in our strength, that comes from being within a community and knowing that we are, and knowing that the other people here have made a commitment and belong in here as well. And Jesus seems to have wanted to create a community. He created the disciples' community, and he created a larger community. We know about at least 72 people, but probably it was much more. And he made a big thing of making Peter into the first leader of what would be the community that survived after he was gone. So there was a kind of, maybe the bishops weren't just horrid when they started to say, well, wait a minute, what are the sorts of things that you can say about Jesus which seem to be in line with what we've heard from the people who knew him, and even from someone like Paul, who didn't know him in the flesh, but seems to have had a pretty direct line to him? And what are the things which are actually maybe old sorts of thought forms which have just been given a Christian name? And so this great sifting went on with the yardstick, and that's how we got the four Gospels. And if you read most of the other Gospels, I think you can, the apocryphal ones, you can usually work out why the bishops sifted them out. Some of them are clearly sort of legendary material. I mean, they're lovely, they're wonderful fairy stories, but they don't have the ring of something which is historically true, as well as opening great vistas into spiritual realities and soul realities and archetypal realities, which I think is one of the hallmarks of the Gospels that we've got. Some of them are, in a way, anti-incarnational, and that became one of the big points. There were some people, this was the sort of extremes of the Gnostic movement, who wanted to deny that it was conceivable that God could have become a human being. Like St. Paul says somewhere or other, it's a scandal to the Greeks. No, what is it? It's foolishness to the Greeks and a scandal to the Jews, the idea that God could become man. Anyway, so with that, then there came this idea, okay, so the bishops have received the kind of discernment. They're the ones that can apply the canon. They're the ones that can say gradually, as I say, over centuries, what's in the gospel, which are the real gospels and which aren't. And then also they're the ones that know what the standard of faith is, what the canon, in a way. Then that's where you get the idea there is an orthodoxy, there is a right way of understanding and thinking about the incarnation and the Trinity and so on. And usually you can actually see how something goes off into an extreme, and then there's a kind of that raises the awareness to that issue. The formation of Christian dogma is almost all reactive. So, like Arius says, Jesus is much greater than us, but he is a created being. Like the angels also had a beginning. Jesus had a beginning. God the Father is far, far away, and he created Jesus, and through Jesus the whole cosmos could come into being. And we worship Jesus because he's like us, and yet not quite infinitely, but vastly greater than us. And that is a very beautiful description of one aspect of the being that we call Jesus Christ. But it's not a description of the Son of God. And so Athanasius, Arius' great opponent, this was in the 4th century in Alexandria, he's the one that says, no, hang on. When we meet Jesus Christ, we actually, we get a window into the inner reality of Godhead itself. And we learn something completely new and revolutionary there. That God is not a lonely monolith, some great eminence far, far away. That actually God is a community, you could say. Athanasius wouldn't have put it like that. But within God, we distinguish three centers of divine initiative and purpose and attention, the ones we call the three persons, perfectly united in one common substance, which is what we call God, in one nature, we would probably say nowadays. So, as I say, in the West, gradually, out of, probably, probably something like that had to happen. You had to start to be able to say, okay, who's in the church and who's outside. But through a whole interesting set of circumstances, which I won't go into now, in the West, this believing rightly becomes more and more important. Ironically, in the Orthodox churches, and so in the Eastern churches, the emphasis was always and remains actually much more on orthopraxy, on worship. And of course, I mean, if you sort of go into an Orthodox church and stand on a soapbox and say, God has no son, Muhammad was right, you probably will get censured, They certainly if you're a priest, I mean, I think they probably would say, yeah, no, I think you're probably in the wrong place here. But this whole idea that holding to the right ideas is what might save us, and being slightly off with our ideas, like we see in the wars of religion and so on in the after the Reformation, where even the Protestants split, and Zwingli and Luther have the wonderful conversation, and they cannot agree. And it becomes so important. Do I hold to the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, or is it just a symbol? And that, I think that's a world where, from what I've understood, when Orthodox people looked at it, they think, really? I mean, we've been living for 2,000 years within the sort of stream of Christian thinking, quite powerful currents and different emphases. And why get hung up about it? So yes, so that's the history lesson, some of which you might need to cut out.
No, not at all.
And so into all of that comes the founding of the Christian community, where
Tom, just before you
yeah,
do that, you kind of brushed over Protestantism very quickly just then. That's okay. But do we need to say a
yeah,
little bit more about that? Because, okay, you've got the East-West split,
yeah,
which happened when?
1054
Okay,
officially.
and
Yeah,
probably there was a long lead up to that, I imagine,
yeah,
with different schisms and things. And then comes
the Reformation.
the Reformation. And yeah, maybe if you could just say a little bit more about that, because I think maybe with the birth of the Christian community, there's a connection there.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so if I try and sort of connect that to this trajectory about orthodoxy and orthopraxy, um, I mean, in a way, one of the things, probably one of the many things, but one of the things that Luther was about, um, in spite of everything I've just said, in a way, he was a kind of he was reacting against what he would have called a works righteousness. So that would have been more on the praxis side than the dogma side. And this idea that there are particular things that you can do, like pay a priest to say a mass for your immortal soul, which will, Luther would have probably said, put you into right relationship with God. Or we sometimes use these old words, justify you, justification. Justification means that you're in a good relationship with someone. I think that's what it means in that context anyway. So what he wanted to reclaim was that actually, in a way, you could say that individual response to the experience of grace, which is given to us not because of something we do or deserve, but because we throw ourselves on the mercy of our Redeemer. And so to begin with, I mean, Luther was he says himself, if there ever had been a monk who had earned his place in paradise through good works, it would have been Luther. He didn't suffer from he wasn't overburdened by modesty, our dear Martin. Um, and because he did all the things, and he'd learned the whole of Scripture by heart, and he knew ancient Greek and ancient Hebrew, and he got up at the hours through the night. I think what was it, every 2 hours or something, or 3 hours, and he prayed and did the Hail Marys and all the stuff. But he could not come to an experience of the mercy of God, and he felt very, very keenly his, how he fell short. Those of your audience who know our act of consecration of man, the Lutheran moment, there's two Lutheran moments in the act of consecration, I would say. And the one is where we talk about, where the priest bringing the offering talks about himself or herself as an unworthy creature. So that experience that I am unworthy, it doesn't matter what I do, or at least it could matter what I do, but I never manage to do enough of it. I can't put myself right with God. That's a very Lutheran moment. The other moment is where we say, before you, we can do no works. That's, for me, that's the one piece of truly technical theological language in our communion service. You can't understand that phrase if you don't know something about theology, because what are works? Well, works are works of righteousness. So although we've done this whole service, it comes really towards the end of the service. We've done this whole great long service, and we've really tried to be part of the offering and follow the words and be active in our listening and so on. But actually, towards the end, we acknowledge, yeah, we can't do anything. There's nothing we can do. So that's Luther, and he was reacting to real abuses and real corruption that was there in the Catholic Church at his time. I don't think anybody argues about that.
And Tom, would you say that he's actually reacting against the Franco-Papal Church? It's not necessarily the whole church, is it, or is it?
I mean, I don't think he was reacting against every priest and every nun and monk and so on. I mean, he married a nun, so he can't be reacting against her. I should think he had a place in his heart for people doing genuinely good things, but it was the marriage of I mean, part of his problem was the sort of I'm finding German words, not English ones. The worldliness of the church, the Pope, who was a worldly prince. And I mean, the thing that sparked it all off, I don't know if anybody learns about these things anymore, but there was this building campaign for St. Peter's in Rome. And they sent off this cardinal, whose name I've forgotten, to raise funds. It was a fundraising thing. And there was this ditty that went round, which I probably also can't remember, to be honest. I'm getting older. But to the effect of, you pop a penny in the pot and your soul gets 100 years off purgatory. That was so that was like the absolute excess of what's called mechanical religion. So it doesn't matter. You can be cursing God in your heart. It doesn't matter. You put a penny in the pot, then you've earned yourself some salvation. And I don't know how far Luther was aware of it, but I mean, there was a huge movement within the Catholic Church, which was really as scandalized by all of this as Luther was himself, notably Thomas More and Erasmus. So there was this humanist movement which wanted a reform of the church. And it's actually interesting that reformation is what, probably Luther would have said he wanted, and what these people would have wanted. But what we got wasn't a reformation; it was a schism, or a revolution in a way, or a breaking off. And there's an incredible correspondence between Luther and Erasmus, which kind of breaks your heart because, yeah, well, if anybody wants to follow it up, it's all there on the internet, where this refined, sensitive, diplomatic, deeply philosophical soul, Erasmus, comes up against the sort of the brute force of this Luther, who, yeah, was not he didn't obey the nicety of argument. Let's put it that way. And so, yeah, it broke away and it became something separate. And then there was even schism within the Protestant ranks. And then, of course, as happens, ironically, within a couple of generations, it became its own new orthodoxy. And there was what's sometimes called the Lutheran scholasticism, which was probably more rigid and more sort of codified than almost anything that had gone before. That's this kind of weaving of forming and living that goes on in all spiritual movements. Yeah, so that's all there in the background. But to be honest, I mean, by the time the founders of the Christian community were around, so the dominant picture in the 19th century, in 19th century Germany, not that dissimilar from 19th century Britain, was the triumph of liberal Protestantism. And this was really, well, there was a kind of accommodation with science. So obviously there were these huge revolutions in the 19th century and even a bit earlier. We always think about Darwin and evolution, but actually it started earlier with the discovery of geological time. Basically, why are there mussel beds high up in the Alps, and the gradual realization that the Alps used to be on the seabed, and then the sort of extrapolation, there's just not time for them to got there if the world was created in 4004 BC on a Thursday, which I think is what Archbishop Usher famously arrived at sometime in the 18th century by just adding up all the years in the Bible. And that was a huge thing. Of course, we simply can't imagine it, because we're all in the paradigm, unless you're a creationist. But you think most people in the world are in the paradigm of that. The years that are given in the Bible are not really 365-day periods. And there's even evidence within the Bible that's not true. Like in the Psalms, it says a year of the Lord is 1,000 years. Or day of the Lord is 1,000 years, I think it says. And then you realize that in Hebrew, 1,000 just means an uncountable multitude. Mm-hmm. So suddenly, I see, a day of the Lord is not 24 hours. So for us, that it's not hard for us to sort of move between the language of 7 days of creation and the idea of aeons and aeons of evolution. But in the 18th and 19th centuries, it was just such a shock. And then the next shock was the evolution of the descent of man, or the ascent of man rather, and Darwin. And so what had sort of happened was that in a way the liberal Protestant theology had sort of ceded the space of inquiry about truth to science, and it kind of reserved the space of something special called faith and morals for religion. And the picture really was that this kind of natural development, the progress, because it was the era where people really believed in progress. Again, my suspicion is that we're teetering on the edge of an era where that will no longer seem, just like a sort of, goes without saying, sine qua non. So then there was this idea, well, when Jesus talks about the kingdom of God, what he really meant was the 19th century Prussian state or the 19th century English state, that in a way we've brought it down through our enlightened scientific methods of helping each other and looking after populations and medicine and so on. And so in a way, what you need to do to be a good Christian is to be a good citizen. And the discussions were all about, sort of how much space should we leave for religion? How far do we keep science back? So if you were very liberal, you basically leave very little space. If you're more conservative, you kind of try and reserve a bit more space for religion to have its say. And yeah, those were the kinds of arguments that were going on. And that's all the backdrop for the, well, religious and theological revolutions that happened after the First World War, because after the First World War, particularly in Germany, where, of course, Germany lost, and the Kaiser abdicated, the German state basically fell apart. There was a real danger of a communist revolution, which would have hooked up with the Russian one. And the Kaiser's role as head of the church or whatever fell apart. So we have to imagine in Britain what that would be if we had a hole like that in the center of national life. All of that was going on, and then there was this feeling that I mean, the spokesperson of it really is T.S. Eliot with The Wasteland, which interestingly was published, I think, the same year as the founding of the Christian community in 1922. So with this feeling that the world of the ancien regime, the world of that really went back to the what's it called, the Congress of Vienna after the Napoleonic Wars, where the shape of Europe in the 19th century was basically kind of fixed, and the monarchies were restored, and this whole kind of idea of perpetuating something from the past, it just came to an end. And so in The Wasteland, I think Eliot, he lists the cities. He says, unreal city, Jerusalem, Paris, Rome, can't remember, he's sort of the great cultural centers of the last 2,000 years. And he just says, unreal. It's all gone. Everything was gone. And so that was the kind of feeling that was there. And it just so happened in very distinct different ways. So when I say a group, I don't mean a self-aware group, but there were, as it had turned out, a group of young people who, for very different reasons, had come across the name Rudolf Steiner. It wasn't that difficult in those days. I think Steiner was a mixture of famous and notorious. He was a figure that, if you read books and you were aware of what was going on, you probably would have heard of him. And in very different ways, for very different reasons, they started to wonder, out of their incredible disappointment, in a way, having been through near-death experiences and, terrible, terrible suffering and so on, having witnessed terrible suffering in the trenches, they came back and found the same old professors having the same old irrelevant arguments that they'd been having 5 years before when they resumed or started their theological studies, and really had this question: what's the new? Where can something new come from? It's not going to come from the theological faculty. And as I say, in very different ways, and actually, it could have all started much earlier, but they sort of missed each other. And somebody had a conversation with Steiner, which he thought meant he had to go off and study for 10 years until he was capable of founding a whole new church and doing every detail of everything that was needed. So, as always happens in history, it sort of depended on what feel like the most fragile and random chances. But they did find each other, and they did all find their way to Steiner, and they did ask him, could he help? And interestingly, his answer, actually from the very beginning, was on the side of orthopraxy. So he said yes. I think actually partly to their surprise. I think some of them probably thought he was going to say, look, forget it with church. You should just become anthroposophical lecturers and spread the word. But he said, yes, I can help in this way. And the sacraments, so the worship, the ritual acts, will stand in the middle point of your community. They will be the central thing in your community. The other thing he said in that very first reaction was that women would stand with equal justification at the altar as men, which we always feel quite proud of, because as far as we're aware, we're the first church with a sacramental ordination. So there's been loads of churches with, sort of low church, just like chapel, whatever, Baptists or whatever, which I think probably would have involved women. But I think we're the first church with a sort of fully fledged sacramental ordination that from the very beginning has ordained women and men equally, no distinction. So those are the two things he said. And so in that sense, from the very beginning, he he didn't say to them, yes, and by the way, make sure your people believe in the Athanasian Creed. Um, he he suggested a creed, which is what we now read in the Act of Consecration, which is in with a couple of exceptions. I mean, if you read it warmly, then you will discover everything that's in the Athanasian Creed in there, or in the Apostles' Creed, or whatever, the great creeds that most of Christianity lives with. It does have a few slightly different emphases, but he gave this as something that the members would work with in a way to support their experience. But he didn't say, this is the entry requirement for membership, that you can sign up for this. So as far as I know, I think from the very beginning, we've never made a requirement of holding to certain beliefs. And certainly nowadays, you know, as I was saying in my example with coming forward for communion, what we're really interested in, and sometimes I say this to people, they say, well, how, you know, how do I become a member of the Christian community? Well, that there is a formal act, but if the question is, how do I join your worshiping community, and sort of why, you know, why do people join? The answer I usually give is, well, because they come and they experience something which they might not be able to explain to themselves, but it's powerful enough and meaningful enough for them that they come back again. And then after a while, they realize, oh, I seem to be coming here every week, or 4 times a year, or whatever my rhythm might be. And then we say, okay, well, look, do you want to actually really formalize that and write your name down in the book? And then we'll call you a member. But the starting point is the experience.
Which, in a way, is what you said earlier about the beginnings of Christianity itself.
Yeah. I
Not
mean, there's this
being.
wonderful moment in the very beginning of the Gospel of St. John, where where John is with some of his disciples, and they see Jesus walking by, and they say, Master, where are you staying? It's actually a slightly funny question, really. But the answer is the thing, because he says to them, come and see. So again, he doesn't sit down and say, oh, lovely, you're my first theology students, I'm going to give you a seminar. He says, come on the journey, walk with me, set off with me, and see what you experience. So that's what, yeah, that's the very long context to the idea of a church where, I mean, of course, you could say there are implicit things, in the sense that, um, why would you sit there if there wasn't some space in your soul for the idea that there might be a God? But having said that, actually, I know somebody, yeah, I won't say anything about where or how or when or whatever, but I'm aware of someone who actually is an avowed, probably 90% atheist with 10% agnostic. I mean, somebody who's really pretty clear there's not a God. And they love to come to the act of consecration because it's so peaceful. And we're fine with that. I might secretly think that I know what's going on in the depths of her soul.
Mhm.
But I don't know that for sure. And I don't, it's not part of my job to try and convince this person, for the sake of your immortal soul, for God's sake, you know, hold fast to these doctrines. I mean, having said that, of
Yeah.
course, that could sound incredibly sort of wishy-washy. So if I had a pastoral conversation with someone and they described I'm trying to imagine what it could be, but they described some desperate struggle they were in, and you know, the framework was definitely that there was no God. I wouldn't I wouldn't hold back in saying, well, you might find it useful to just try this idea out and see whether that makes your life more fruitful. But not because it's my job as a priest to convince them of something, but to answer a pastoral need.
Well, this idea of holding to a belief, anyway, is a question that arises as you're speaking. What does that really mean anyway? So, for example, we might decide, okay, yes, there is a God, and I believe in a God, but at certain times in the day, maybe I'm acting in certain ways or doing certain things that sort of deny that, or even in my thinking, I might question. I go, well, I believe in that, but right now I don't have the
Yeah.
sense that there is. So, holding to a belief, sort of brings up questions anyway.
I mean, language can be a helper there, and just digging down into words. We've got these two words in English that we use almost interchangeably, faith and belief, to have faith and to believe. And we use them interchangeably to mean more or less the same thing, which is what's I think in theology is called propositional belief. So there are certain propositions about the world, like for instance, that there is a God, and I hold to that as an intellectual act. But if you dig a bit deeper, both of these words are really, they kind of tell a different story. Um, you get that in the words that we have that are built from faith. So, for example, if you talk about a faithful person, that doesn't mean somebody who's really good at believing in unlikely facts about the world. We call that credulous, don't we? A faithful person is somebody who's loyal and who's steadfast and who sticks at something even when it's difficult. So that's a kind of clue. And believe, if you know a little bit of German and you know about how sounds change in languages, in German, there's the word lieben, which means to love. There's even a word belieben, which means to prefer. And believe, leave, love is the same thing. There's an old form in English, I would as lief do this. It's really kind of strange. And it's not leaf like on a tree. It's Lief, I would as lief. And it means that would be my love, that would be my preference. So to have faith, you could say, in its roots of the word, means to be loyal, to be steadfast, to be true. To believe means to hold something dear.
Mm.
And in a way, that kind of turns the whole concept of what would it mean? If I said I believed in God, does it mean that in every moment of the day I need to remind myself there is this invisible being who, nevertheless decides the difference to everything I do? Or would it mean something more like um, trying to hold fast, to be faithful to an experience that I've once had? Perhaps maybe in a church service or in meditating or in prayer. I think for most people it's a bit like that. We don't manage to stay in the kind of peak or in the depth, in the complete beauty of contemplation and concentration that we maybe sometimes attain. But those moments, we we can hold on to them. We can, in a way, we can sort of have a preferential option for them. We can say, I decide that those moments of deep knowing, perhaps in a life crisis when I fell to my knees and prayed because it was so existential and so real, I decide that's the reality. And even if I can't feel it with that intensity every day, all day, nevertheless, I'm going to behave almost as if I did, because I know that's my yardstick, that's my canon. And that would be the faithful side. And maybe the believe side would be to really make a commitment to try to discover, to try to hold dear God in everything. In the Christian community, we wait a long time in the service before we use the word Father when we're addressing God. And to begin with, we talk about the ground of the world. We actually address God as the ground of the world, which is it can be a bit of a challenge. How do you say, oh, ground of the world, as if, because the ground is a thing, and if you say you to something, then is it a person? But actually, with time, and this actually, funny enough, this was echoed in there were these wonderful Protestant theologians in the mid-20th century, Paul Tillich and Reinhold Niebuhr, who really they were very influenced by existentialism and, to a certain extent, psychology and social sciences. And I think it was Tillich who talked about God as the ultimate ground. And in a way, again, there's a kind of decision there. I'm not going to get bombarded with evidence all day long, every day, that the ultimate ground of reality is God. But I have a glimpse of it, I have an intuition of it, and that could shape my conduct. So I try to behave as if everything that comes towards me, every encounter with another human being, every moment is precious. And in that sense, I hold it dear, I love it. And that would be believe. So again, it takes us a long way away from, like Swift lampooned the wars of religion, didn't he, in Gulliver's Travels? Don't know if you read Gulliver's Travels, but there he has the war which is going to sort of destroy this world. Gulliver is the giant, and it's the Lilliputians, or these tiny people. So he has the complete overview. He can kind of see, and that's why Swift uses this trope. So you get the complete overview of this society, and you gradually realize that they're tearing themselves apart. They all believe in the same God, but some believe that the way God has decreed, you must open your hard-boiled egg on the round end, and others believe no, you must open it on the the pointy end, and for that they're kind of destroying their world. And that was Swift's not very well disguised satire on the finer points of doctrine that became the cause of the wars of religion. So that's a very different world than the idea of allowing my soul to expand, allowing something to become my guiding star, holding true, holding faithful. And there's when Jesus talks about belief in the New Testament, again, of course, he doesn't say you should believe in the creed, because there isn't one. And he doesn't say you should believe all the things I've told you about how the persons of the Trinity relate to each other, because he hadn't told them all those things. And he says things like, where your treasure is, there the forces of your heart will be. So don't make your treasure, don't make your ultimate concern. That's another kind of Tiddish word. God values. What's your ultimate concern? Who's really the most important? What or who is really the most important thing? And Jesus says, look, if you store up treasure on the earth, it'll become your God. It's going to disappoint you, because it will, what does he say? Moth and rust will come in, and thieves will come in and steal, and store up treasure in heaven, because where your treasure is, there will your heart be. So again, not really propositional belief.
Is another aspect of this, could we bring this in as well, that it's not about holding to the letter of the Bible? So I had a discussion with someone recently who said that we need, Christianity must be Bible based. It must be based on the word of this conflation of word of God, and the word of God as written in the books of the Bible. And my argument, if you like, to that was that, well, Paul didn't have the Bible, so was he not practicing Christianity, for example? But
quite a good parry.
Thank you. I don't know how it went down, but so in one sense, not holding to dogmas. I don't know, you phrase it much better than I can. But then also not clinging to the Bible as an instruction manual. In many ways, it's not an instruction manual. There are instructions in the Old Testament more so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's another, incredibly important subject, which maybe to some people's surprise has become very, very relevant all over again. I think up until maybe, well, even just a few years ago, there was a sort of assumption amongst the sort of enlightened um, left, or no, not even left, the sort of enlightened intellectual layers of society, that we'd finished with all this, but now suddenly it's very close, and which probably tells you something about the emptiness of some of the culture that was served up by that secular humanist consensus. And so maybe as partly as a reaction to that, there's this real wish to find certainty. Yeah, I mean, the word of the Bible, you see, that that's a very that that idea that there are words which were written down hundreds of years ago and which have a literal meaning, which I can discern now, which is the same as the literal meaning they had, well, hundreds or thousands of years ago. And therefore, there's no expiration. I just need to understand, use my current framework to work out what it means, and and that is then the word, and that tells me clearly what I need to do. That's a very modern concept. It's a very modern way of thinking about how the Bible works. And actually, I mean, it's datable. It goes back to a movement which gave fundamentalism its name, and it was a reaction to the beginning of the sort of triumph of science and evolution and so on. And well, I'm just gonna, oh, it's okay. Are you getting background noise, or is it all right?
I can't hear it.
Okay,
No.
good. And certainly, I think, if you read in the so-called church fathers, the early theologians, nobody would have been more surprised than them to hear that this was going to be the attitude that people had, because in the earliest church, there was a huge understanding, and really also coming from the sort of the philosophical and the mystical background that was just kind of washing around as part of the culture of the time. There was a great understanding of what it takes to actually take in a word and allow it to unfold meaning within me. I mean, nowadays the philosophical term is hermeneutics. So the study of meaning, how we arrive at meaning. And I don't know actually when that word was invented. But if you read the person who is generally acknowledged, I think, to be the greatest theologian of the Greek East of the first 1,000 years, which is Origen of Alexandria. I mean, he distinguished between, I think, 4 levels of understanding scripture. And he says, yes, there's the historical sense, that's your kind of gateway. And then there's the kind of application to the soul. And then there's the kind of moral sense. And then there's the actual revelation of something spiritual. And to really grasp a word of scripture it's an inner process. I mean, nowadays, as I say, with the sort of, as far as I've understood it, the modern idea of hermeneutics, you would notice, and this is operational now in our conversation, I have some thoughts and I bring them into words. And now through the medium of the Zoom call, you hear some noises, and you bring I think in hermeneutics they call it your horizon of meaning. and it meets my horizon of meaning. And so, for example, if you didn't speak English, meaning would not arise, or certainly not in the same way. So you've got to bring something to the table, and the meaning that arises in a way, it's a co-creation, because you have to bring understanding. And I said something about what happened in Boston in 1981 or whatever, and you have a whole world of references that you brought to bear to allow that to become an image in your soul. And in a way, you took away your version of my story. Now, if that goes too far, then we just all make stuff up, and that's relativism, which all the people are very frightened of. But you don't have to go full on relativist to notice there's a process. And in a way, if I attend to the process of this co-creation, and if I acknowledge that it's happening, then I can also develop a conscience about it. If I pretend that there's no process, if I pretend I simply receive words and I know the meaning, then that's when I'm in the most danger of being subjective, because I'm not acknowledging that reading a prohibition on eating prawns in Leviticus had a different meaning for a desert dweller in the 3rd millennium BC or whatever than reading that prohibition today. And as I say, if you go back to the church fathers, they don't mind the things about prawns. And so, nowadays we sort of, I think even probably the most observant Jews don't eat prawns. But I shouldn't think very many fundamentalistic Christians avoid prawns. I don't know. But, there's things about how you tie up your ox and everything. And Origen just says, oh, of course you don't. That in that instance, the historical sense isn't useful. Don't go and buy an ox just so that you can, demonstrably not tie it up on a Sunday or whatever. But the ox represents the will, and the rope represents the, I don't know, the aesthetic discipline or whatever, ascetic discipline. And he just says, don't worry about that. Don't get bogged down in all that detail. Make it real in you, and then you'll discover the reality. So I think that there's this like kind of the two dangers are so often. The one danger is to say, oh, there's no real meaning. We just all make up our own thing, and we're all condemned to be in our own subjective world. And if you acknowledge that there is something like hermeneutics, then that's what you're preparing the way for. No meaning, everything relative. Everybody just does what they like. And then the other extreme is to say, we know what these words mean. And actually what that generally means is, I know what these words mean, and my group seemingly knows what these words mean, but your interpretation, no, that, and so there you're projecting self and absolutizing it. On the other side, you could be relativizing truth completely. But in the middle, I think there's a careful process, which, as I say, actually has its own conscience. Because if I listen to you, you get that like in conversation, if you're counseling somebody, woe betide the moment in a conversation where you hear yourself saying, oh, I know what you mean, that happened to me. Because it didn't. It didn't happen to me. Your experience did not happen to me. My capacity for empathy might be increased by noticing that, something in your experience resonates with something in mine. But your experience is yours. It's not mine. And if I get sort of intoxicated on thinking, oh, look, he's just like me, then all sorts of weird transferences and projections are going to go on. So there's a conscience about this co-creation. And in that sense, I would say, I try to be faithful to the word of the gospel. I definitely do. And I try to be conscientious in how I allow that word to take seed in me, to take root in me, and grow. And the tree that grows is, it's my tree, but I hope that it's faithful to the seed from which it took root.
Yeah, but because as well as that way of looking at it, there's also just these practical things about translations from
Yeah.
these ancient languages.
Also,
The
this fascinating thing that we don't have the Bible in Jesus's words. We don't have the words that Jesus spoke. There's very, very strong evidence that he spoke Aramaic, even down to the fact, I mean, first of all, we know that somebody of that time would have spoken Aramaic. It would have been very, very strange if he'd spoken the Koine, the Greek of the day. He might have understood it, and a lot of people think he probably did, but the vernacular language of the time in the Holy Land was Aramaic. And part of the evidence for it is that there's some really key words which the gospel writers have preserved, so that when it gets really important, then we get the original, as if it's almost like a mantric word, like this. We just had it in the summer, didn't we? The deaf man with the speech impediment, where he touches his tongue with his spittle and he says "Ephatha," which is the Aramaic for "be opened," or when he raises the young woman Talitha Kumi. So there are these few moments where you notice, oh, I see. Yeah, when it really comes down to it, he speaks Aramaic. So unlike the Quran, where with the Quran you've got this picture that Muhammad, who was I think actually illiterate, receives the writing, and the writing itself is almost like the Quran, the words of the Quran for Muslims. I've been told by people, I don't hardly know anything about Muslim theology, but I've been told by Muslim theologians that in a way, when we talk about the incarnation of the word, what a Muslim person hears is, oh, they're talking about the Quran, because it is the Arabic. It's the high Arabic of Muhammad's day. And we know probably more or less the words that Muhammad received in dictation in his cave. With the Gospels, we're one step removed. And for me, that feels like we're really being encouraged to attend to the fact that even reading the originals is a translation, because all speaking and understanding is a translation. If we take this hermeneutic thing seriously, we're speaking the same language, but you're translating me into Michael world, and I'm translating you into Tom world. And then hopefully we're also, creating something new together that isn't just Michael or Tom. So yeah, amazing.
It is amazing. It's amazing that we can understand each other at all.
Yeah, it in a way, that's why I feel a bit sad um, for fundamentalists in a sense. I mean, it's a horrible generalization. If I think of that fundamentalist, well, I mean, I can make that generalization not about the world of Christian fundamentalism, but there is, I don't know whether you've noticed, a fundamentalist tendency within the Steiner world. And there is a tendency to take words that Rudolf Steiner is supposed to have said, because remember, aside from his books, there's a gap between the words that we get and the words he spoke. I mean, first of all, I generally read in German, but you probably read in English, and many, many people read Steiner in English. So that's a gap. But then there's even a gap before that, because the lectures were written down by shorthand reporters. They weren't recorded. And some of the shorthand wasn't decipherable. And in fact, I think there was somebody who took loads and loads of shorthand reports, and they used a shorthand system that doesn't exist anymore. And it took ages for the archive to discover how to decipher, because shorthand is like these squiggles. And the thing is, shorthand is you're not writing down every word. So in a way, you translate it into a language, into a symbolic language, and then somebody comes along and translates it back again. We've got similar things with the Bible where people have done this thing. It's actually going around at the moment, where somebody reckons that they've reconstructed the Lord's Prayer in Aramaic by looking at the Greek and looking at the Syriac version that we do have and everything. And I met somebody recently who said, we know what Jesus said in the Lord's Prayer. We really don't. So, it's a really interesting hypothesis. But, anyway, so we don't have Steiner's in the lectures. We don't have Steiner's words. We have something that was translated and retranslated. And then if we're reading in English, and then, of course, it's 100 years ago. and words have changed their meaning since then. And cultural context, there's things that Steiner talks about where if you know the cultural context, you know that he was, in a way, he was being funny. He was telling a joke. But if you don't know the context, then you just, oh, gosh, the master has spoken, and this is very, very serious and important. So with Steiner too, if we ignore the hermeneutic process and we lift words out of their historical context and give them a truth value that is, that we can know right now and which will never change, that makes me very sad, because it's it's leaving out something which is, as like you said, it's leaving out the miracle. The miracle is that we can read Steiner and bridge those gaps, and with conscience attend to the co-creation of meaning with somebody who's been dead for 100 years. And I believe in moments that in my study of Steiner, I would say I have arrived at some dim intuition of the spiritual reality that he was pointing to. But about 15 years ago, actually, I tried to get out of the habit of ever saying, we know because Rudolf Steiner said. Because I don't think I know anything because Rudolf Steiner said. I don't think I know anything because Jesus said. If I'm going to tell you I know something, it's because I've struggled for it. And I'm open to being, I might discover tomorrow how wrong I was. And of course, I'll also tell you about my sources. I'm not going to pretend, I think I know some things about angels, but I'm not arrogant enough to pretend I wouldn't have got there without the help of Rudolf Steiner. But I don't know them because Rudolf Steiner said. Rudolf Steiner said some amazing things about angels, which I set off on a journey to work with for about 7 years. And after that, I feel like, yes, I've felt into the consciousness of an angel as a kind of thought experiment sufficiently that I would say I know how angels behold us. But it's my work and an incredible debt to Rudolf Steiner.
I think we reached a really excellent point there to finish on. And that would lead into another conversation about the spiritual hierarchies, such as the angels, archangels, etc., which I know is a deep study of yours, Tom. And to come to this place of thinking about what it is to have a conversation and to actually meet another human being and to understand or to seek to understand what's going on within the thoughts and the feelings and the soul of another, and also what was possibly going on in the thoughts and feelings of people writing the Gospels, or of indeed Rudolf Steiner speaking. And there's just really, really important questions in there, I think. So yeah, and this thing of the fundamentalism is such a big issue, such a big problem in all different areas of life as well. And we did a really wonderful little exercise or practice when I was at the Seminary for the Christian Community in Hamburg. And basically what we did was we sat in a circle. We took a short verse from one of the Gospels, and it was read in several different languages from several different translations. And then we were asked just to sit with that, or to see, I think we had like 7 minutes of silence, and we could just be with the images that arose within us, the pictures that we had from the verse that we'd heard, and then we explored it together, what arose for each individual. And it was quite startling, actually, the such different things that arose, and we really learned so much from one another. And that approach to the Bible, but I think to Steiner's work as well, where it's like there are these statements made that can sound like dogmas, actually, can't they? But
Yeah.
rather than holding them as things I must cling to or believe or decide this is how it is, I can actually keep the question open. I can have a question mark next to them. That's what I'm always suggesting to people that I'm working with is, teaching anthroposophical concepts is just keep a question mark next to this. This is not for you to cling to. See, explore it, work with it, um, sit with the idea or the concept for a period of time and see if it bears fruit for you. If it doesn't, then leave it alone. Um,
I think Adam Bittleston, who was a priest of the previous generation and a great teacher, I think he's famous for having always said, "Don't say no, say oh." Just kind of
okay.
that. I mean, of course, there's a commitment, and the commitment is to holding the question. And in a sense, that for me, that's like faith. So if somebody says, "Do you believe in Rudolf Steiner?" I would say, well, I have a commitment to exploring the things that he says, really because I've had so many experiences of how fruitful that was. So you can't, if you say to somebody, well, just oh, don't worry. I mean, just, well, yeah, no, but there is, why would I carry on reading? I carry on
Mm.
reading, I carry on exploring because something resonates with me deep down. But yeah, it was very beautifully put.
And that's the
Maybe
faithfulness, maybe, that you were
exactly.
talking about before, being faithful to uh, testing an idea out in a way.
Yeah, exactly. And we know from Steiner that, he loved those amongst his whatever followers, whatever you call it,
Careful,
who
careful,
who
careful.
yeah, who resolute well, he loved, yeah, I mean he did have what would you call them? They're not disciples, they're adherents or um he loved the ones that came back with robust questions. And actually, one extreme example, a supreme example of that, is Friedrich Rittelmeyer, who was the first head of the Christian community, who'd been a pupil of Steiner's already for 10 years before the Christian community was founded, and who would work for years on things and absolutely not just take it over on blind faith, but stay committed to the exploration. So yeah, there's something there. Maybe can I just get a tiny plug in? I know you kindly
Please do.
mentioned my Substack and everything, but just because you were talking about this Bible thing in Hamburg, and it just so happens that on Sunday afternoon, 4 o'clock British summer time, I'm doing a webinar working with a gospel reading, really with this precise aim of discovering how to go deeply into a reading and how to let its meaning become real in me. So all the details of that are on the Substack, which you're going to put in your email footer. But I just thought, since you just mentioned that, I
Yeah,
mean, it's not
please. Yeah.
exactly the same as what you're doing, but it's right next door in a way. And since we spent quite a lot of time talking about this whole thing about, yeah, meaning and how do we discover it, it could be interesting for your viewers. And it's happening in a couple of days' time.
Great. I hope I can get this released and published
Oh
before that.
yeah, that's true. Of course, you're
That's
not
the only
going to do
thing.
it instantaneously. Yeah.
Not possibly. Have to see how I go
Okay.
with time, but
Yeah, I know it's a bit of work for you. Well,
I'll try to do that.
you could do a sort of preview snippet and then trail the gospel thing in that. Anyway,
I'd
you
be
see how you
very
do it.
no, I'd be very happy to do that. Yeah, I can also put a post up on the where you can just write something about it too. So yeah,
Whatever. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
So in a moment I'll hit stop on the record, but just
Yeah.
stay there, Tom, because I'll grab those details off you.
Sure. Yeah.
Um, but yeah, look, I just want to thank you for a wonderful conversation. I do have a selfish motive, really, doing these interviews, these conversations, because I just want to talk to these very interesting people. So thank you very much for your
It's been
for
a
giving
huge
us your
pleasure talking
time.
with you. Really, I've had a lovely time, and yeah, thank you for what you're doing. It's really great to see all that. I had a brief flick through, more than I would possibly have time to listen to, but you've got some interesting speakers and really good topics. So keep up the good work.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, no, it's an absolute pleasure for me. So thank you for your time. I'd love to do it again and delve a little further or go in a different direction even.
Yeah, maybe
Um,
sometime we could do the hierarchies one or whatever. We can have a look.
That sounds great. That sounds great. And
Okay.
just before I do finish up, just to ask the viewers and listeners if you would like to support the podcast and support me to continue to do this, the links for the Substack and the Buy Me a Coffee and the other options will be in the description below, as will links to Tom's work with the Perspectives magazine and Tom's books that you can purchase as well, and also any other work that's happening within the Christian community. Tom's based in Forest Row, and so I can link all that below as well. But thanks again, Tom, and talk to you soon.
Right. Okay. Bye bye.